Okay, in this part of the Chapter 6 PowerPoint, we're going to look at the microscopy of bone. We'll start with the cells. So we have osteogenic, osteoblasts, and osteocytes. There's also the bone lining cells. Then we'll also take a look at osteoclasts, but the osteoclasts do not come from the same mesenchymal cells as that of the osteogenic through bone lining cells, but we'll mention all of them. So let's start with the stem cells. So mesenchymal cells can become osteogenic cells, and both mesenchymal and osteogenic cells are stem cells, but osteogenic are a little bit closer to becoming osteoblasts or osteocytes. But the osteogenic cells, remember from part 1 of the video lectures, are going to be in the periosteum and endosteum, which is what used to be called, the periosteum at least, the perichondrium, but now is around bone, so it's being called the periosteum. The endosteum is very similar, it's just dense irregular connective tissue, and the osteogenic cells are able to give rise to osteoblasts and even bone lining cells. Osteoblasts are important because cells that have blast at the end are laying down or secreting the matrix. So for bone, we get the secretion of osteoid, or the organic component of bone. Then later the calcium phosphate salts will be added to bone and make it hard. Osteocytes are mature bone cells that no longer move about laying down osteoid. Instead, they are stuck in their lacunae and they monitor and maintain the bone matrix. Then you have bone lining cells, and they're going to be located where bone remodeling is not going on. Other than that, scientists aren't sure exactly about their function, but what's really important are the osteoclast cells. Now, the osteoclast cells do not come from or originate from mesenchymal cells, whereas the osteoblasts, the cytes, the bone lining cells, even the osteogenic cells, they originate from mesenchymal cells. The osteoclasts actually come from the same hematopoietic stem cells as red blood cells, monocytes, macrophages, basically as the blood cell, so it's in relation to that. The important part to focus though on is the function for osteoclasts. It's because they break down bone, and the breakdown of bone via osteoclasts is called bone resorption. So here we can see bone structure, and we're looking though at microscopic bone structure. So here we have the blue arrows indicating the osteoblasts. These osteoblasts are actively laying down or creating matrix. So that's this light pink layer here represented by the yellow arrows. So that is bone matrix that the osteoblasts just laid down, and we would call that osteoid because osteoblasts are bone building cells. So they would synthesize and secrete collagen fibers, other organic components of bone matrix, and again that organic component of bone matrix is called osteoid. And this would initiate the process of calcification because you have to have something to calcify, but it's not till the calcium phosphates, those salts are laid down for bone to become hard. And again, you're finding the osteoblasts in both the endosteum and periosteum because they can be made by osteogenic cells. Next, we have the osteocytes. The osteocytes are mature bone cells stuck in the lacunae, so they're trapped by their own secretions that have since hardened, and they're no longer secreting matrix. So osteocytes are not bone building cells, but they're bone maintenance cells because they're responsible for maintaining the bone tissue. Osteoclasts are huge compared to osteocytes. So here's an osteoclast. It has many nuclei, and then compare it to an osteocyte. The area where it's absorbing bone, breaking it down, is the resorption bay. And again, that breakdown of bone, the process where cells digest bone, that cell being the osteoclast, that's called bone resorption. And these cells are huge. They contain anywhere up to 50 monocytes, which is a type of white blood cell. If you'd like to see an animation, just Google osteoblast and osteoclast animation, and you can see the movement or the resorption process of these large cells. And the reason you'd want to resorb bone is just for either bone growth development or lifelong maintenance and repair. So now that we've looked at the cells, let's talk about the bone matrix. Let's talk about the extracellular matrix, which is a major component of all connective tissues. And the bone matrix itself is part organic and part inorganic. It's going to be more inorganic than it is organic, and the organic component is what we call osteoid, and that's laid down by osteoblasts. So osteoid is the organic component secreted by osteoblasts. So that's things like collagen fibers and plenty of other organic materials. The collagen fibers are going to give bone a really good resilience. It gives the bone the ability to resist stretching and twisting. So it's the organic osteoid that gives bone the ability to resist stretching and twisting. Whereas it's the inorganic component, the hydroxyapatite salts, that make bone hard. So the inorganic component of the bone matrix is hydroxyapatite. These are two salts, calcium phosphate and calcium hydroxide. Calcium phosphates are definitely a little bit more common. And then, of course, other minerals like magnesium, fluoride, and sodium. But this characteristic hardness that you associate almost immediately when you think about bone allows bone to resist compression. So the inorganic components make bone hard and allow it to resist compression. The organic components allow bone to have resilience and resist stretching and twisting. So both together make bone really strong. Next, we're going to look at compact bone. So when we're talking about the Haversian system, we're talking about it being a unit of compact bone. The Haversian system is just another name for an osteon, which is the structural unit of compact bone. It's weight-bearing, it's essentially column-like tubes. The central canal also could be called the Haversian canal, but that's where you have blood vessels and nerves, kind of a main location to find them, but they can branch off into the rest of the osteon. Then you have multiple matrix tubes that make up a singular osteon, and those are called lamella. Where the lamella are adjacent, that's where you would find the lacunae that contain mature bone cells called osteocytes. And there's three different types of lamellae. The ones we're talking about making up the osteon are called concentric lamellae. So they surround the central canal. But there's also leftover lamellae from bone remodeling called interstitial lamellae. And then if you're looking at a long bone, there's lamellae that surround the diaphysis and lamellae that circumference or go around the circumference of the diaphysis are called circumferential lamellae. So let's look at a couple of those types. So here we have a central canal where blood vessels and nerves would be. Then you have 1, 2, 3, it looks like about 4 lamellae that are around the osteon. So these are concentric lamellae. Then you have what looks like incomplete rings between the osteons. Those are interstitial lamellae. And if I go forward, here are circumferential lamellae. So imagine this going all the way around a long bone. These lamellae here would also go all the way around the long bone. So that's what makes them circumferential lamellae, is they go around the circumference of a diaphysis. There's also plenty of other anatomy to look at, like the perforating Volkmann's canals, which are going to be canals at right angles to central canals. So there are ways to connect blood vessels of the central canal to the other parts of the osteon. Then you have lacunae. You have small cavities. You can call them cups. You saw them in hyaline and elastic. You also saw them in fibrocartilage. So this structure shouldn't be new to you. So lacunae are just small cavities that contain osteocytes or mature bone cells. And then you have tiny canals called canaliculi. They're very small, kind of thin and hair-like in their width, and they connect lacunae to each other and the central canal. So here is a mature bone cell, an osteocyte, and it is found in its lacunae, so its cup-like area, but these are not completely enclosed. Instead, there are hair-like structures that allow projections off of the mature bone cell to communicate with other mature bone cells, and those hair-like canals are called canaliculi. So even though oftentimes you'll view an osteon from the top view, osteons are actually multiple cylinders, and those cylinders contain collagen fibers running in different directions, which again are helping the bone resist twisting and stretching. Here's a different view of the central canal. You can see it has veins, nerves, fibers, arteries, so it has blood vessels and nerves. And the lamellae are indicated here. In this picture, you have 3 concentric lamellae making up this osteon. And here's just another view. We have the cylinders that make up an osteon, even though you normally find it in this view. The cylinders around the central canal are the concentric lamellae. The central canal is the center. Then you have circumferential lamellae going around the diaphysis of a long bone, so it would go around this entire long bone. And then left over from remodeling or between osteons are interstitial lamellae. Here is a Volkmann's canal. So if this is a central canal, at a right angle to the central canal is Volkmann's canal. You would have endosteum covering Volkmann's canals, central canals, the medullary cavity. And the endosteum again is on the inside, whereas the periosteum is on the outside. And you have both a fibrous and osteogenic layer of the periosteum. The periosteum has blood vessels. Some of those perforate via nutrient foramina and get into the bone. And then you have perforating Sharpey's fibers that hold the periosteum to the bone matrix. Here are just some other views. Here's a good view of the lacunae in the central canal, as well as this image here. Here's another view of the Volkmann's canals. Again, they are going to be perpendicular to the central canals. Here's a close-up view of the concentric lamellae. So they're the ones that surround or make up the osteon, but surround the central canal. Here would be the central canal with its blood vessels and its nerves. And notice where the concentric lamellae meet is where you see the lacunae. And last but not least, let's also talk about the microscopic anatomy of spongy bone. It has no osteons, but the trabeculae are able to withstand a lot of stress because of their curved structure. They have lamellae, they have osteocytes and canaliculi, but they're irregularly arranged, so don't worry about labeling that. But do know that they have those, just no osteon, so no necessarily central canal. And there is blood vessels in here, and blood vessels tend to be in the endosteum, and those are what are supplying nutrients to spongy bone. And then our next topic is going to be on bone development. So that finishes up the anatomy of bone, even the microscopic anatomy. So stay tuned for osteogenesis, which is a process also called ossification, and how our cartilage models turn into bone.